Hello and welcome back to the channel. The news have been pretty interesting this week. Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, has finally resolved the Northern Ireland Protocol problem. So this means we can all cheer, we can all be very happy, and we can all clap him on the back for a job very well done. And I don't want to take away from the man's achievements. I think he has done the right thing. And it is definitely good that there is some kind of agreement on the table for everybody to consider. But I don't want to get too premature and too congratulatory without first understanding what is happening. Now, of course, I have not read the document itself, but I think there are some initial things that are going to be worth considering. So something like this, there's actually a negotiation worth talking about, and so it would be positively rude of me as a professional negotiator of over 10 years of experience not to comment on that. So for the benefit of anyone who's new to this channel, this is what I do. I talk about negotiations, and for once I have something exciting to talk about. Now, Rishi did describe that people thought it was impossible to do a deal. Which comes as a bit of a surprise to me as a professional negotiator. That deal didn't seem particularly impossible. Difficult, yes, but not for the reasons that perhaps he may be implying. You see, the issue is that the whole problem is a created problem. It's almost, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's an artificial problem, but it is a created problem. It's a problem created by Boris Johnson being somewhat lazy and untrustworthy and signing up to a deal that he didn't think he would have to adhere to. A bit like his marriage vows, really. So in that sort of context, Northern Ireland Protocol is an artificially created problem from the Conservative government. So what Rishi Sunak has done is come along and fix the problems created by his predecessors. So in that context, it is not impossible. You just have to go backwards in a way. But I don't want to take it away from the guy. He has done certain things which I think are worth commenting on. Now, regular viewers of the channel will know that I talk a lot about differences in negotiation style. And I think that comparing what Sunak has done with Johnson is a great example. So going back a little bit to negotiation 101, there's two particular styles, or two extremes of styles. One is adversarial style of negotiation, one is collaborative style of negotiation. In the adversarial style of negotiation, you didn't mean you have to be hostile, it doesn't mean you have to be rude or anything like that. It just means that you and the other side are not aligned. You have different viewpoints, you want different things. But you're there to negotiate something to get what each side wants, or at least as close to it as is possible. That is what an adversarial style negotiation means. And in an adversarial style negotiation, you withhold information quite a bit. You try not to give too much away, you try to exploit the other's weaknesses. At the other end of the scale is a collaborative style negotiation. Now this doesn't mean you're not competing with the other side, but in a collaborative style of negotiation, you're both trying to reach the same endpoint. So for example, to get a thorny agreement signed. That would resolve various frictions and problems. That is the end point. The question then becomes, how do you achieve that? And so to achieve that, you have to work closely with the other side as part of the negotiation. You have to exchange views, you have to exchange information, data, evidence. And you do all of that in a constructive way in order to identify all the problems and then establish solutions or mitigations against each one. And of course, you've got various points in the middle. So consider adversarial and collaborative as extreme ends of the scale. Boris Johnson adopted an extremely adversarial style, which is simply not how government negotiations work. All government negotiations will generally lean more towards the collaborative style. That is because they are trying to deal with complex issues. And so whenever you're trying to deal with anything complicated, you need an element of cooperation from the other side. Because if both sides are being dogmatic and refusing to cooperate, refusing to compromise, refusing to even talk, well, that's not really any kind of meaningful negotiation. And unfortunately, that's pretty much the techniques, the style that Boris Johnson and his crowd were adopting. So Rishi Sunak had come in and he wants this problem to go away. He'd got enough problems to deal with, and this isn't a legacy problem left by his predecessor, or predecessor's predecessor, whichever way you want to put it. So he had immediately changed the tone of the negotiation. And this is something I talk about quite a lot. Tone comes down from the leadership. The leadership gets to decide how those negotiations are going to feel. And that's important because perception is important in politics as it is in negotiation. So what Sunak has done, and commendably so, is reset the clock a little bit and said to the EU, right, let's talk seriously, let's get this deal done, let's figure out these problems. So he and his people have adopted a much more collaborative style. And the reason why I say that with a high degree of confidence is not only the fact that they've actually solved the problem, I'll talk more about that in a bit, but also because the EU President, von der Leyen, has very much openly stated that this is what Sunak and his team have done. She has made it very clear that he has come in with a fresh attitude. That doesn't mean total capitulation or anything like that. It just means he's come in with a better professional attitude. And so the UK and the EU were finally able to get down to business and resolve the outstanding issues of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So in that context, this was never an impossible deal. It just required the right people, the right attitude, the right context, the right techniques, and the desire to go and do it. Sunak had that desire, Boris Johnson did not, and still does not have that desire. And this can be seen by the political commentary that has surrounded this announcement. Now, before launching into the analysis about the benefits of the Windsor framework, quick caveat in that I've not read the document myself. When I get the opportunity, I will attempt to do so. So I am only going on what has been announced, what has been stated and commented on. But as is always the case with these things, the devil is in the detail. So it comes down to reading it, rereading it, and for suitably expert minds to go through the text and to identify whether there are any complications, whether there are issues that result. So with that caveat set in mind, there are some immediate things that strike me. So first, of course, is that Sunak has announced that there is immediately going to be improved trade between Northern Ireland and mainland Great Britain. And of course, this is going to be achieved through the green and red lanes. And yes, this looks immediately true, and my congratulations to Sunak. He has done a great job of obtaining this benefit, which was achieved by agreeing to what the EU asked for. Yes, that is exactly what it's done, and this is the right thing to do in that particular context, in that he has accepted the wisdom of the proposal made by the EU quite a long time ago, which was not at the time accepted by Boris Johnson or Liz Truss. So it is a workable solution. It is not a perfect solution, as various people have pointed out, but it is definitely a workable solution, and it's one that the EU came up with. But of course Sunak is attempting to take credit for. Which leads me on to an important concept for negotiations, which is one of the secrets to good negotiation. is that what you are doing is letting the other side have it your way. And if the other side wants to take credit for what was essentially your proposal, then that is fine. You accept that because your objective isn't to take credit, isn't to look big on the stage, it's to get the job done. So we can see that in that von der Leyen is saying, yes, she's happy with it, but she's not publicly pointing out, well, yes, of course we're happy with it because we were the ones who suggested it. So, but we shall let that one pass. The next thing to comment on is the whole issue of sovereignty. Now this is a bit of a tricky one because the underlying fundamentals possibly haven't changed, which in Northern Ireland does have actual access to both the UK and to the EU markets. But when it comes to and sovereignty is a political thing more than it is economic, although the two do go together. And I think what has happened is the EU has appeared to concede a fair bit on sovereignty. But all they have done is tightened up on some of the language and been more specific in order to clarify the position that the Northern Ireland does remain in Great Britain, which should always be in the position. I don't think the EU has ever disputed that or tried to refute that. The problem is that politicians like to use this issue for their own particular ends. And so the issue of sovereignty has been confused with the issue of economics. But there is an interesting angle that I've noticed to this. And this is where the issue of sovereignty truly lies, and that is when you start to talk about legal jurisdiction or jurisdiction application. And in this context, it appears the EU have moved while not moving on the fundamental issues. And what I mean by that, and this is where the devil will be in the details, is that the EU have apparently tightened up where the ECJs will have jurisdictional competence. We'll get to comment on laws, EU laws that apply in Northern Ireland, but they tightened up the language in a way to make it look narrower, so that it appeared that more UK law is applicable. I'm not personally persuaded that they've significantly changed what was the reality before this agreement turned up, but sometimes it does help just to do that little bit of wordsmithing to make things that little bit clearer. And a lot of the negotiations I do tend to be a lot about that sort of thing. You really are focusing on the meaning of various different words in order to make their intent clearer. And that just takes a lot of attention to detail, a lot of collaborative working to achieve. And this is what I think has been done here. The stormont break concept is quite interesting, and actually it's quite cunning to use what already exists in the Good Friday Agreement and to apply that in the context of the Northern Ireland Protocol and this agreement. And that's another secret to negotiation, particularly at government level, is that you try to avoid inventing new things as much as possible, because usually that's what caused the problems. If you're able to recycle what already exists and apply it in the context of what you're negotiating, then you can find it surprisingly easy to unblock what seems to be insurmountable problems. So again, this goes back to my earlier point. This wasn't an impossible deal. It just required the right attitude and the right thinking to unblock those particular issues. Now, this leads me on to perhaps a pedantic and fussy question. But hey, I'm a negotiator, so, roll with it. And that is, what is this Windsor framework really? And this is a question I don't see journalists asking. And of course, it would be utterly mean for me to suggest that the reason why journalists aren't asking this is because they're too incompetent or do not know the subject matter to ask this. But with a little bit too much knowledge, like I might have, we do tend to ask these questions. Because the phrase Windsor framework is very interesting. Windsor, obviously, is politics. They picked the name, it's got great symbolism, and they don't want to call it the protocol. Okay, so we can see that as being politics. But when it comes to framework, well, framework has a bit of a different meaning when it comes to international documents. See, a framework is normally a document that has lots of subsidiary arrangements underneath it. Or perhaps they're applying it in a context of setting overarching broad principles. But the trouble is, a framework would normally be the top level document if you're doing that. And that can't be the case because there already is a Northern Ireland Protocol which is already subservient to the withdrawal agreement. So when people like Sunak say this is a new agreement or this is a treaty, I might beg to differ from that. Because for this to actually be a proper agreement that replaces or supersedes the Northern Ireland Protocol, it needs to be called something like the Windsor Agreement or Treaty. It is not. So what that indicates to me is that this is a subsidiary arrangement to the Northern Ireland Protocol, or perhaps, if I was to be a little bit charitable, an amendment. If I was to be even more cynical, I would say this is an implementing arrangement. And this is what the EU have been saying all along. They were very happy to agree, to discuss and to negotiate some kind of implementing arrangement or annex to the Northern Ireland Protocol in order to improve how it has been implemented and to smooth out some of the problems that have arisen underneath it. So my guess here, without looking into the document more closely, is that the EU have got what they wanted here, but Sunak has required the document to be called something else in order to make it sound more important and more significant than it actually is. So in my final remarks on this topic, I'd like to offer my congratulations to Sunak for a nice bit of political theatre. This is all about politics. This is all about him cementing his power. This is all about him undoing the mess of his predecessor. And this needed doing. So in that context, I'm not going to criticise the guy who's doing the right thing. I might be a little bit awkward and point out that there's an even easier solution that didn't require any of this, which was, ironically enough, just to go back to aligning with single market rules. Perhaps even better still, rejoining the single market. And that would have eliminated all the problems and would have eliminated the need for the Northern Ireland Protocol itself. And so this is perhaps the danger zone that Sunak now finds himself in, because this is all about politics. He needs for the DUP and all the other Northern Ireland parties to agree to this Windsor framework. They'll start calling it the wrong name soon, aren't they? So he needs them to agree to it. If they do not, if they object to it, if they dig in their heels, then he's run out of road, and any successor to Sunak has actually run out of road. Because whilst there can be other agreements, other frameworks that could be negotiated with the EU, this doesn't change the fundamental principles as far as probably the unionists see it. The only way to change the fundamental principles is basically to put a border in Ireland, or for Great Britain to realign or rejoin the single market, at which point the Northern Ireland Protocol becomes redundant. That issue has not gone away. And so, whilst this looks like a good achievement for Sunak, right now, in negotiation terms, he is now being held hostage by the unionists. his career, his success in this area is completely dependent upon them agreeing to it. Because if they don't, he possibly could be in some political trouble. So I suppose it's perhaps like a game of gambling where you throw all your cards in and roll the last dice or whatever it is. It's a very high stakes for him on this one, and he has now lost control, and that was inevitable. He can't retain control forever. He has successfully controlled the negotiations. He has successfully brought them to what looks like a decent conclusion. But now he is at the mercy of Parliament, and he is at the mercy of the parties at Stormont in terms of what happened next. So this thing is not done yet, and I always caution people on any negotiation. They think the job's done when they've got a written piece of paper that's agreed. But the job isn't done until the approval authorities of both sides have signed and said they've agreed. And it's important to make that distinction. It's not done until it's truly done, and that requires the senior people to seal the deal, to approve it. Sunak has not yet done that. That is the final hurdle on this deal that he needs to achieve. So of course, if we assume that he is successful and achieves that, then perhaps we could all celebrate, because maybe, just maybe, that means this whole Brexit nightmare thing is over. Well, not so fast on that one. You see, by my calculation, with the winter framework done, dusted, and that particular problem sort of dealt with, I would estimate that Brexit is probably around a 10% done type mark. There's still another 90% to go. So let that sink in for a bit. We still have another 90% or so of Brexit yet still to come in order to truly move off this sort of dystopian nightmare that UK politics seems to find itself in on this topic of Brexit. And there's a whole host of reasons for that, mostly technical, mostly boring, all about borders, all about standards, all about trade, all of which has been a complete mess, and all of that needs repairing, and that is not a fast job. So Brexit is not done yet, I'm afraid. For those who on either side of the debate who may wish it was, I'm afraid we're going to have to wait for quite a bit longer, a lot longer. But there is an agreement, and that is good, and that is positive news, and we should take that as positive news. And I think we should also take the approach as positive news, because we can hope, perhaps, whatever anyone views politically about whether Brexit was a good idea or not, the implementation of it has been utterly ridiculous. So for Brexit to work, for those who wish to make it to work, then there needs to be more of a professional approach. And that means tackling all the issues, having proper solutions, not just burying your head in the sand and pretending they're not there and pretending you've won the war without having actually done anything, which seemed to be Johnson's strategy to pretty much everything. So the jury's still out. And in previous video I have said that Brexit is a bit of an o'clock, that when the younger generation come through, they will probably reverse Brexit. But in the meantime, this is a change. It's a change in tone. It's a change in almost making bits of Britain more aligned with the EU again, and that is Northern Ireland in a way. It has cemented Northern Ireland's alignment with the EU in many crucial key respects, because Sunak is right that it is a great economic opportunity for Northern Ireland. But of course the pressure will be on, well, what about the rest of the UK? And when there's that little chink in the wall, that little crack in the armour, and sometimes things can start to disintegrate quite rapidly. So it will be very interesting to see whether this is the beginning of the end of the whole Brexit saga, or whether it's the end of the beginning. depending on how things go. So I hope you found that insight interesting. There will no doubt be more in the future, but this is my initial take on that announcement, which is all very exciting. Gives me a reason to comment on things publicly on the internet. I've got an actual negotiation subject that people might be interested in. So I hope you found that helpful. Please do subscribe to this channel if you want to see more of this sort of content. And I look forward to seeing comments in the box below.